do this in 2 weeks, so we're not rushed. Okay, so first topic then is the question of how do issues of GMO, of genetically modified organisms, how does that affect kashrut? So as you see in the first source here from Heber's excellent overview of this for the COR, which again, if you don't know, COR is like the main kashrut organization in Canada. There's two main ones in Canada, COR in Toronto and MK in Montreal. There are some out in the West Coast also in like Vancouver area, like the K check thing. I forget what it's called. I don't know, you see it on a lot of like Costco products. I don't know. It's like the VOD of Vancouver, whatever it is. COR doesn't matter. The COR is the VOD is like the VOD in Toronto. Rabbi Heber is excellent. I really like Rabbi Heber as a person and as a writer. He's really helpful. So he summarizes when the COR got the Shaila. It went like this, right? After 2 decades of exhaustive and rigorous review, the United States Food and Drug Administration has recently approved the first ever genetically engineered food animal, a fast-growing Atlantic salmon called Aqua Advantage salmon. Likewise, in May of 2016, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency also approved the sale of the Aqua Advantage salmon. These Atlantic salmon are genetically modified to carry a growth hormone regulated gene from a Pacific Chinook salmon, which is further engineered to be under the control of an antifreeze protein gene called a promoter from the eel-like ocean pout fish. The genetic modification allows the salmon to grow year-round by increasing natural production of the growth hormone and reducing sensitivity to the cold, all without affecting its ultimate size or other qualities. The fish is said to grow to market size in 16 to 18 months, rather than 3 years that it normally takes Atlantic salmon to mature. The FDA has concluded that food made from Aqua Advantage salmon is as safe as food from other Atlantic salmon. The law does not require food containing ingredients derived from Aqua Advantage salmon to be labeled as genetically modified. While both Atlantic salmon and Pacific Chinook salmon are inherently kosher, the eel-like ocean pout fish is obviously not. Right. So this was the shaila, and the question was, how does this affect kashrut? So there are 2 kashrut questions we have to deal with, essentially, or 2.5, let's say. Okay. 1. Does the introduction of a gene from a non-kosher animal to a kosher animal create kashrut problems? 2, if you modify, right, that's assuming there's no external change to the animal. Second is, does adding fins and scales, let's say, to a non-kosher fish, a non-kosher species, make it kosher? And vice versa, just taking away fins and scales from a kosher, right? Not like cutting them off, but genetically modifying them such that they grow naturally without, or not unnaturally, or whatever you want to call it, without fins and scales. Does that make it not kosher? Those are the 2.5 or 3 questions that the post dealt with as this began to become a reality. As I said, they did the same thing to tomatoes. They didn't give it fins and scales. They gave it the eel gene, or whatever gene. Okay, so let's see. So the main shuva that all the kashrut organizations base themselves on is this excellent shuva in the Binyan Av by Rav Bakshi Daron, who passed away about a year ago. So in Chelek Dalet of Binyan Av, Shuva Mem Gimel, he deals with this question. So the first question, does taking a gene from a non-kosher animal and putting it in a kosher animal, does that create problems? Does that make the kosher animal now not kosher? So what does he say? What does it depend on? You said you read 18. I know it's hard, but let's see if anyone got it, and then we'll read it. We can read it inside. What does he say it depends on? Okay, so let's read it, right? It says, "Ve'im ma'avirim b'handasa genetit genim shel ba'alei chayim ha'asurim b'achila le'ba'alei chayim mutarim u'tzmachim mitared bayat kashrut ha'ma'achalim." If you move the genes from a non-kosher animal to a kosher animal, or to a vegetable or fruit or whatever, we have to deal with the kashrut trials that come up. B'derech klal hagenim hamu'avarim einam achilim. Genes are not edible as such. Ein Bahem Tam, U'V'derech Yisrael, Mit'apshu V'Nivselu Mechila Kelet. They are not, they have no taste, and they have rotted, essentially. They're no longer edible to a dog, meaning you were talking about chemical, at the chemical level by that point. This is something that happens in a laboratory. It's not something that happens at the level of edibility. Kach she'ein she'ela shel ta'arovet, isur baslat gen mimekor isur l'semach b'vadei lo l'bal chai. And therefore he says, it is obvious to him that this is not called mixing kosher and not kosher together, right? That's his first move, is that in order for it to be not kosher because it's mixed in, it would actually have to be real, right? Like something with taste. It has to be food. Genes are not food, so what happens at the genetic level, that can't make it actually not kosher food as a mixture, right? This is not, pig mixed in your, it's not pig mixed into your cereal, right? Whatever this is, right? It's having it in the genetic. So that's his first move. Gam, b'yisurei achila shenerzim b'matzu b'chometz b'pesach, isur tzarech liot b'geder machal. So he said, look, theoretically, you could have distinguished between two cases. Cases where you're dealing with something which is asur b'achila, which is only asur to eat, and things which are asur b'hana'ah, which can't be benefited from. Right? Because you could have said, look, maybe if I move something in which is only asur b'achila, like pig, like something that wasn't shechted, nevela, shreifa, so that is only asur b'achila. But if it's basar b'chalav, right, it's meat and milk, or chametz on Pesach, or whatever, that's asur b'hana'ah. You can't benefit. So maybe you'd say, okay, maybe it would forbid it as benefit. That's question 2. Ha'isur tzarech liot b'geder machal. He says, no, I don't think that's true either, because still, it needs to be food. That's what's asur b'hana'ah. V'adin hamufak ein bo shem ochel klo. It's nothing. It's not food. Ulam. Yesh ladun beginning המושתלים למאכל המורגשים היטב במוצר חדש מן המעמיד שהשפעתם קיימת ואין בטלה. He said, I have a third factor. It's not a mere mixture, but maybe it's called ma'amid. So what's ma'amid? So the general rule is, at what point does not kosher food mixed into kosher food become batel, become nullified such that you can eat it? How much? A 60th, right? Or nothing. Ta'am. But there's an exception called ma'amid. Ma'amid is when the non-kosher food gives the integrity to the kosher food, then it's also even with less, right? So like an emulsifier, right? An enzyme that keeps it together, right? That allows it, right? Something, a ma'amid, right? Rennet in cheese is the classic, right? Where rennet is not a 60th, but not kosher rennet is a problem because it gives cheese its integrity. It makes it what it is. It makes it cheese rather than milk. So he says maybe you put in this case, the eel gene, maybe you'd say it's ma'amid, it's giving it its structure, its integrity. So therefore it should not be batel. דוגמה למצר חדש, שדווקא בבעיות כשרות הוא המגוון הצמחי, שלדון בו מטעם איסור מעמיד. He said, for example, we do this in cases of cheese, right, where we have these fake rennet, but it would not be a problem. And הגבינות מייצרים על ידי המנה בקבר עגלים, שיש בחומר מפריד לחלב ומי חלב ולגבינה, לצורך זה השתמשו בקבר עגלים כשירים בלבד. In general, we used to make rennet from, how did you used to make cheese, kosher cheese? From kosher animals. You use the stomach of the cow, and the rennet would make it. And why, right? It's not a problem basar b'chalav, because that's not considered actually part of it. Interesting question of itself, meaning it's clear from the sugya. But now, we just take the gene out and use the rennet. We create it artificially. Right? We grow it basically in a lab, in a petri dish. We double it. What's it called? Replicate it. They're forgetting my English. Replicate it. We replicate the gene. And then we create natural rennet from the original gene from the animal. So what if you would take it from a not kosher animal? So now what? The rennet is a classic case of a ma'amid. And this rennet is made from a not kosher animal, but not directly. You took the gene, multiplied it, and now what you're dealing with is the artificial, right, what you produce in a lab. And even if they're batel now. They can't be batel because they're mamid. You feel their effect. אולם הגנים שהשפיעו של גיוון החלב סביר שאינם קיים כלל, הם רק פעלו לפעולה ראשונית, וגם בגבינה, גיוון לא נעשה רק ידי הגנים, אלא בתהליך משותף של מפגש בין מרכיבים, ויש בדרך זה משום זה וזה גורם. ואסור אין הגורם יחיד and הגורם ישיר. He says, I don't think it's a problem. Why? Because you're not dealing with the original gene. That's gone, and now you've copied it with chemicals and with whatever. So at this point, there's a principle called Zev is Agorim, that Ma'amid is only Asur if it's the only thing that causes the result. But if it's a combination of multiple factors, Zev is Agorim, then it's not. So artificially created rennet, yes, there was the original gene that you built on, but these are copies which you added chemicals to replicate them. So at this point, you can't say that it's only the not kosher thing that creates it, so I think it's not a problem. כך שאין לחשש איסור משום מעמיד, אם אין מרכיבי איסור בדבריות בלבד, הגנים, ואין מה שכתב, etc. ויש מקום לחשוש לגבי גנים שיש לו משפעה מאוצר מבגין מיין נסח, אסור בין שריש מנהרה, וכל המאוצר אסורה. But he said if you directly were to create benefit from something which is usher for benefit, like yain nesach, maybe it'd be usher. But he said when it comes to kashrut, things that are just usher b'achila, I think it's not a problem. Things that are usher b'hana'ah, that are the only thing that are creating the results, so maybe it's a problem, but he said in general, he doesn't think it's going to be a problem. And this became the standard position. Rabbi Genak, who's the CEO of OU Kashrut, put it very succinctly. Let me just read his 2 lines in number 19, which is, they've taken the gene of either a pig or a turkey, and with it they've enhanced the tomato. The OU's position is, and I think also those of other kashrut agencies, is that this is indeed a kosher tomato. Right? That's about as simple a summary as you get, and basically people follow this notion of Reb Bakshi Daron. Yes? So cheese can't be cheese without rennet. Right, and that's why, right, he's saying even by cheese where it's a mamid, he thinks it's not a problem if it's copied. But yeah, if it's not a mamid, so presumably it wouldn't be a problem at all. Right, he thinks it's not a problem. If it's a mamid, he said maybe you think it's a problem because it's not batel, but even there, as long as there's multiple factors, he thinks it's fine. The only case where he thinks it's not fine is if it's made from something which is asur b'hana'ah, and it's the sole contributor to this quality in the food. Anything short of that, he thinks is not a problem, which really never happens, right? For what? Yeah, so Mohammed, yeah. That specific one, right? Meaning if that couldn't exist, right? But like, what would that mean it wouldn't exist? Like without the eel gene, it would still be a salmon. It just would be. So that's why he's saying that's probably not mamid, right? His example is rennet created from not kosher food. Okay, but he said even there he doesn't think it's a problem as long as it's not direct. So on balance, as Reganak says, when it comes to like inserting genes into the food, it's very rarely going to reach the standard of a sur hana'ah sole contributor, which gives it its integrity. You're never going to get there, right? And therefore, in general, that case, the post can say that's fine. Okay? The more complicated case that they get to is what if you change the physical structure of the food? Like it's not just that like, I look at a tomato, I don't know whether it's cold resistant or not. I have no idea, right? But if I looked at a salmon which no longer had fins and scales, I would know. I mean, I don't know if I would know. But presumably anyone who knew anything about fish, even like basic anything about fish, could presumably tell, right? I assume I could figure it out, but I don't know. I cannot count on the fact that I know what a scale of a fish looks like enough. I assume I should be able to figure it out, right? Looks like scales. I don't know. I hate the smell of fish, so I stay away from them. That's just. What it would happen? What do you think? What do you think? If you could create a salmon without fins and scales or an eel with fins and scales, what do you think? What does it depend on? Conceptually, right? What do you think it depends on? Well, let's start, right? How do I know fish need fins and scales? Let's start with fish. How do I know you need fins and scales? It says so where? In the Torah. Yeah, good. It was not a trick question, right? As you see in number 20, right? Starting at Pasuk Tet. את זה תאכלו מכל אשר במים, כל אשר לא סנפיר וקסקזת במים, בימים הנחלים אותם תאכלו, כל אשר אם לא סנפיר וקסקזת, בימים הנחלים, מכל שרת המים וכל נפש החיה, אשר במים שכזים לא חיים. If it has fins and scales, you can eat it. If not, not. Easy. Good. So now what do you think? What is the conceptual question that drives the sugya? Yeah. Or? Very good. So the way poskim put it, in Hebrew they call it siman or siba, right? In English we call it causation or correlation. Meaning, when the Torah says you need fins and scales, is that the siba, the cause for it being kosher, the reason it's kosher, or the siman, the indicator that it is kosher, meaning it correlates to the species. It shows you that the species is a kosher species, those that naturally have fins and scales. But it's about the species, it's not actually about this, right? Having fins and scales is not what makes it kosher. It's being part of the species that naturally has fins and scales that makes it kosher. Now this would cut in both directions. If you say to siman that fins and scales make it kosher, so then an eel, sorry, did I say siman or siba? If I think it's siba, it's what makes it kosher, then salmon without fins and scales is not kosher. An eel with fins and scales is kosher. If you think it's the siman, it indicates that it's part of a kosher species. The opposite is the case. Right? A salmon will always be kosher, and an eel will always be not kosher. That, in a nutshell, is the conceptual question that the poskim dealt with. Now, how would you prove such a thing? So, if you look at number 21, they try to prove it from this very weird case in Bechorot, where the Mishnah tells you that para sheyolda kimin chamor. What if you have a cow that gives birth to a donkey? The chamor sheyolda kimin sus, or a donkey that gives birth to a horse. Patur me'a bechora. It's patur from the bechora. Shneimar peter chamor shnei pamim ad she'avlad chamor v'nolad chamor. Because it needs to be that the parent and the child is a chamor. Now, what does this sound like? That animals are defined not by their species, but what they look like, because obviously the child of a donkey is genetically a donkey, but it sounds like we define it by what it looks like, right? And therefore, it is not fully a donkey, so it doesn't need Petra Chamor, it doesn't need to be redeemed. You know Petra Chamor, right? Firstborn donkey, you have to redeem with a sheep, right? I know you don't see this mitzvah very often, every so often you do. Were you there? Did you go when they did this? It was a big deal in Toronto a few years ago. I went. It was crazy. Because my landlord was the one who did it, Ziring. Like, he had a basement apartment that I lived in when I lived in Toronto. So, like, he invited me very happily, and then they shechted it in my backyard, which was very weird. Yes, but then they brought the sheep back and shechted it in the backyard, which is definitely not legal. But whatever. Whatever it was. Yeah, it was a little bit crazy. The Mishnah then continues, Umahem ba'achila, what about eating them? Behemat harash yelda kimin behemat me'ah, mutar ba'achila, utme'ah shelda kimin behemat harash ba'achila. So, but then the Mishnah goes and says, that's only by Peter Chamor. But when it comes to Kashrut, it goes by the parent. So what does that, at first glance, seem to say? That it's about the species. Right? Meaning it's whatever the parent is. Meaning, or in modern parlance, we say whatever it is genetically. Doesn't matter what it looks like. What comes from a non-kosher thing is not kosher. What comes from a kosher thing is kosher. Dag tamei shevala dag tahor mutar ba'achila v'tahor shevala dag tamei asur ba'achila lefi she'einu gidulav. But if a kosher fish swallows a not kosher fish, or vice versa, it is whatever it is because it's not its child, it's just what's in its stomach, right? If you find a whole not kosher fish in a kosher fish, that is not kosher, right? Because it's a not kosher fish, which is swallowed whole by the fish. Fine. So the first glance, you would say that from the Mishnah, at least for kashrut, it sounds like it's about species. And therefore, the salmon should be kosher no matter what, and the eel should be not kosher no matter what. And that is what the Abarbanel says. Very clearly, he says ואין הכוונה באלה תנאים שבעבורם תהיה בהמה טמאה. כי הם אינם עושים טהרה בעצמם. It doesn't mean that these make it kosher. אבל הכוונה בזה היא שהם סימנים. They are indications that it's the right species. מורים על היות הבהמה היא טהרה והדרים מורה היותם טמאה. Right? Their lack shows they're not kosher. If it's a siman. It's not a siba. They're the part of the right species. That's the abarbanel. So according to that, you would say salmon always kosher, eel always not kosher, doesn't matter. Now, it's possible that this is not true, right? And there are those who challenge this. Now, before we look at the next sources, I'll say that this is most obvious by fish. But it gets a little bit harder. What would you say about birds? Right, the Torah, the Gemara tells you that most birds are kosher, not birds of prey, and right, they have simanim. Except, how does the Torah describe birds? It just gives. How do we know which one's kosher? It just gives you a list, right? It's just a list. These are the birds that are not kosher, and everything else is kosher, right? And what about animals? Animals have simanim also, and therefore you need to ask, first of all, the siman siba question, both by animals and by fish. And whenever you say by animals and by fish, it could be that birds will be different, right? Because birds don't have simanim. Right, birds seem to be a species, right? So you could theoretically say that animals and fish are actually siba, right? That it's actually the simanim that make it kosher, as opposed to birds, where it's clearly about species, because the Torah just gives you lists, right? And not simanim, even though the Gemara gives simanim, that's not what the pasuk says. Okay. So we saw the Barmanel, even by fish and birds, but by fish and animals, seems to think that the issue is a siman. That it's about species, and therefore salmon will always be kosher, eel will always be not kosher, pig will always be not kosher, and cows will always be kosher. But if you look at 23, the rugged Shavar says as follows: Ach be'emet kach tzvila l'rabbeinu diyish nafka min l'bein simone behema l'simone o. He says there's a difference between animals and birds. The gabi behema simanim u'atara shela machma gzerat hakatuv. He says no. When it comes to animals, it is a siba, and therefore by animals, if you could create a pig that chewed its cud, it already has split hooves, it would be kosher. And if you could create a cow that didn't chew its cud, it would be not kosher, because the rugged Shavar, unlike the Abarbanel, says no. When it comes to animals, it's a siva. What makes it kosher is having split hooves and chewing its cud. What makes it kosher is fins and scales. But, skip down to the next line. He says, fish and animals, he thinks, it's what makes it kosher. אבל סימני עופות וסימני חיה לגבי חלבה זה רק have a siman. But when it comes to birds, where the Torah gives you a list, it's really about species. So according to the Abarbanel, everything is only a siman. It's all about species. If it's defined as a salmon, it's kosher. If it's an eel, it's not kosher. If it's a pig, it's not kosher. If it's a cow, it's kosher. If it's a chicken, it's kosher. If it's a stork, it's not kosher. That's it. Doesn't matter what other genes you put in it. But according to the rugged Shavar, no. By animals and fish, it depends. Does it have fish and scales? Then it's kosher, even if it's an eel. If it doesn't, it's not kosher, even if it's a salmon. Same by pigs and cows. But by birds, it goes by species, because the Torah just gives you a list. Now, it could be that you would say, I'll leave Rishon Zalman for a second. So this is really the question. You seem to have this machloket between the Rugged Shavar and the Barbanel as to what the case is, at least by birds and animals. If you look at number 25 in the Gemara says, Amar Abayi, Tarnegola de Agma Chad Mishronas Fekadu, Vahainu Marza. The chicken of the Agam, of the swamp, has one of 8 Sveko. Amar Papa Tarnegola de Agma Sira, Tarnegola de Agma Sharia. The rooster of the Agam is kosher, is not kosher rather, but the chicken, meaning the female, is kosher. Now, what is this rooster chicken of the swamp? Because that's weird, right? Doesn't it sound like they're the same species? One's male, one's female, right? What does that mean? Does that tell you, right? What is that? Doesn't that indicate that it's not about species? If you have the male be not kosher and the female be kosher, maybe it's about some sort of siman, even by birds? Tosfos says, nah. So Tosfos 26 says, that can't be. Because whatever comes from kosher animal is kosher. Whatever comes from not kosher animal is not kosher. If it's a kosher bird, it's a kosher bird. Doesn't matter. And he says all species, male and female, are going to be equivalent. They're not actually two of the same species. They're two different species. That one they call the rooster of the swamp, and one they call the chicken of the swamp. They're really two different species. One of which is kosher, one of which is not. Tosfos is very clear that by birds, it's about species. However, Tosfos in 27 is less clear. Tosfos says that even though by birds you would say there it really makes sense to be about species because the Torah never gives you simanim, Tosfos says no, the male of this species has no simanim. And it's not permitted based on the rule of anything that comes from a kosher animal is kosher. That's only true if it gives birth to a live animal. But since it gives birth to an egg, you can actually split between the parent and the child. So Tosfos, shockingly, even though the Torah doesn't give simanim for birds, he seems to think that the simanim are actually indicative, and therefore you could have species of animals where some of them are kosher and some of them are not. The Kovach Shurim has this question as well. So what you have so far is that the following, right? We already said, if you just introduce a gene, so it's probably kosher. But if you actually change the physical structure of the animal, so the Abarbanel seems to think that all fish, birds, animals, it's all siman. It's all about the species and not really what it looks like. So you can't, if the species is a kosher species, it doesn't matter what it looks like. The Rugged Shavar distinguishes it says birds are about species. Fish and animals, where the Torah actually lists the simanim, that's what makes it kosher. So you could have a trait, you have a non-kosher salmon and a kosher eel. Tosfos, in one place, seems to go farther and say even birds is about simanim, so you could have, theoretically, a non-kosher chicken. And he deals with the problem of Yotzei Min HaTamei, the Yotzei Min HaTahor, which seems to say that everything goes by species, by saying that only if it gives birth to live animals, but not eggs. Now, the truth is that in Shulchan Aruch you do seem to get a machloket. Efrach shenolad mibitzat nivela treifa mutar. Hagav yizram lo negen lachatchila yizoyer. Shulchan Aruch says that whatever, even a child, a baby bird born from the parents when they're not kosher is kosher, which implies that it goes by species, right? It's a kosher animal, it's just a treifa, right? Kosher species is not kosher because it wasn't ingested properly or whatever. And the Ramah says we don't, which might imply that that it's not about species, it's about whether it actually came from something kosher. The Shach, though, notes that the Aturei Zav, the Ater Zav, Hishmi Kol Agazu, the Yafachiv, and the Malan Alach, whatever, Shinim some first lot of Bishati. So that's ridiculous. So that's a weird chumrah. really, it's just about species, and anything born from a chicken, from a kosher species is kosher, that's all it is. We just don't reject it, and therefore the majority view is that whatever the parent is, if it's a kosher species, it's kosher, and that's all there is to it. Now, Reb Chaim argues based on the Rambam that this may only be true by species, where we care about the parent. But by treifa, it could be that we'll care about the parent l'chumra, meaning it could be that by species, it's all right there, it doesn't matter kosher, right? Whatever the parent, whatever species it is, the child will be. But he said treifa might be different. And he writes in 32, based on the Rambam, I'll skip the Rambam for a second, which I probably shouldn't do, but we're running short on time. He says, and if something comes from a non-kosher species, that's different from a treifa. He says, when it comes to species, so then it just goes by the parent species. When it comes to a treifa, the reason that we don't transfer the treifa status to the child is because it's not intrinsic, which is a good way of explaining the difference between species and not species. Okay. The truth is that there is one other place where this comes up. That's 33-34. Which is the status of chayshinon zera ha'av or not, whether when you have a non-kosher father and a kosher mother animal, whether it gets the status of the mother or the father as well. But Tosfot there says it's probably mutter because Zev is a go-rain. That's a bit of a complicated subject, but I'll leave it. But the main conceptual question, since we're already running short here, is pretty clear, right? Is in all these cases, when we say that something is kosher, is it about the species or is it about the actual simanim? So what we saw was that the Abarbanel thinks everything is always about the species. The Rogatchover splits between birds and animals where the Torah describes the siman and says, no, it actually has to have the siman, and birds where it's about the species. Tosfot in one place says, no, even birds is really about simanim, even though the Torah doesn't mention the siman. The upshot of it is that, according to the Barbanel, a salmon is always kosher, an eel is always not kosher, a pig is always not kosher, a cow is always kosher, a chicken is always kosher, and a stork is always not kosher. According to the Rogatchover, chicken is always kosher, a stork is always not kosher, but a salmon with fins and scales is kosher, but without fins and scales is not kosher. And an eel normally is not kosher, but if you could modify it to have fins and scales, it would be kosher. Same with cows and pigs. Parallel. But by birds, it goes by species. And Tosfot, in one place, seems to think even birds, right, it goes by the actual simanim. What did the poskim conclude? So, Rabashi Daron, Rishon Talmud Orbach, the OU, the COR, they assume the introduction of a gene, kosher. Introduction of a gene from something which is Asr Ba'ana, that accomplishes whatever it accomplishes in the animal all by itself, if you could come up with such a case, not kosher, but that's not really what's going on usually. Right? Because that would have to be like Yayin Nesech or Basar B'chalav, somehow actually affecting the animal by itself. But that doesn't usually happen. If it did, then it might be ulcer because it's hana'ah, because you're getting benefit even if it hasn't changed the identity of the animal, you're still benefiting. They assume that by fish and animals, the simanim are indicators, and therefore salmon is always kosher, eels are always not kosher. Same by animals. Pigs are always not kosher, cows are always kosher. But by birds, the majority follow the Rogatchover that by birds, it's by species. Right, by birds, it's definitely by species. So they think that's true even by fish and animals, and definitely by birds. Okay? The other issues, quickly, there are some people who raise the issue that, we're supposed to maintain our health, and there are people who believe that GMOs, right, genetically modified foods, are unhealthy. There is no scientific evidence that backs that theory up at all. All the scientific research that's in says that genetically modified foods are perfectly healthy, but that is really that's a scientific question, right? That's obviously, if scientists decide that it is unhealthy, so then you'd have to take that into account because of this broader issue. The other issue that folks can bring up is just that even if you think it doesn't affect the health, if there are people who, for their belief in science or ethical reasons, don't like GMO, then for honesty reasons in business, you probably should tell them when you're using GMOs if it really matters to them. But that's an honesty in business issue. So that's the other issue that the post can bring up. Okay? But that's the first set of issues that post can brought up in GMO. The second one, which is really the first one on the sheets here, is the question of, can I create this to begin with? Right? We're just assuming you've already created it. Now you have to deal with the kashrut. But are you allowed to create it? Is that a problem of kilayim? I guess we'll do that next week. Okay?